Solidarity as a principal Catholic virtue is a very recent addition and a very recent bit of theological reflection. It really has to do, if I could sum it up, is the notion of the common good universally. Because we can talk about common good in the sense of the common good of the Reed household, or the common good of the Newman community, or the common good of Greater Chapel Hill, etc. Solidarity takes this notion of the greater common good and brings it out into a completely worldwide vision of things. Now, when you understand that, you understand that the normal ways in which Catholic theology develops, that is, out of the patristic period, the ancient church fathers, and then out of the Middle Ages, this is all completely blank. We find no notion at all of solidarity, because in fact, the early church fathers and mothers in the first 4 centuries of Christianity had no knowledge that there was a wider world outside of the Mediterranean basin. And basically the same thing with the scholastics. The New World was unheard of. Asia was somewhat understood as being there, but no real notion at all of anything. The secular notion of solidarity really begins to be understood in the 19th century. And it's understood in the 19th century really for 2 reasons. 1, the steam engine, and 2, the telegraph. Now, it's mind-boggling to understand that from the time of Julius Caesar to the time of Napoleon, armies could only move at exactly the same pace. And I use Julius Caesar because, of course, the basis of the Roman roads that allow those armies to transverse easily. But for that entire 1900 year period, transportation and communication simply could not advance because there was no technology. With the beginning of the steam engine, we then had steam railroads and steam ships. And then the telegraph connects. And then the adaptations of the telegraph, for example, that allowed pictures to be sent from one end of the world to the other. Another interesting thing to keep in mind with this, we talk about Roman Catholicism being obedient and in communion with the Roman pontiff. Up until Pius IX in the 1850s, the world had no idea what its pope looked like, because we simply had no way of transmitting pictures widely around. So once we make these technological advances, then moral theology has to keep up with this. This, of course, gets accelerated in the 20th century due to increasingly globalized commerce and communication. Communication, especially in the 20th century, first radio, then television. And again, television, those of a certain age will remember seeing Vatican II opening on television, something that would have been completely unheard of. To see, for example, the live funeral of John Paul II would have been unheard of sometimes before. So all of these communication and technological advances have drawn us closer together as a people worldwide. It's even more so now with computer technology, that it is quite possible to maintain some level of real relationship with people whom you never physically meet and whom you were never physically in the presence of. Now, as we all know from Zoom, those level of relationships lack a little bit. They're not quite the same thing as person-to-person, live hugging kind of relationships, but they meet a blank, and they do create a certain level of community. Now, the notion of solidarity really does begin a little bit more on a secular level. It starts more on a secular level than it really does as a theological kind of a virtue. And it's the flip side of contemporary globalization. that we all do really coexist on a planet. I suspect that for those of us of a certain age, the first time we really ever paid attention to the word solidarity was in the early 1980s with Lech Wałęsa and the union movement in Poland, Solidarność, which overthrew Polish communism. And this notion of a worldwide interdependence, and that name was extremely significant. Because if Leninist Marxism had said workers of the world unite, Solidarność was saying people of the world unite for liberty and freedom. Extremely threatening to the communist regimes. Solidarity begs us to pay attention to the fact that although we are in this increasingly globalized society, this exists all too easily with huge levels of inequality. Huge levels of economic inequality and quality of life. What are these the effect of? First, exploitation. The rich exploit the poor. Sometimes it's the first world rich that exploit the third world rich. Sometimes it's the third world rich that exploit the third world poor. Exploitation. Secondly, oppression. We are unfortunately aware that the democracy index, the worldwide democracy index, which has been followed by sociologists, is going a little bit backwards in the last couple of years instead of going forward. That is, there is more political repression, there is more political control, there is less political freedom in the world. And finally, corruption. Corruption is endemic in many countries. And in many third world countries, unfortunately, corruption has simply become a way of life. And not merely in third world countries. I'll share my own experience from Italy, certainly a first world country, but Italian professionals, doctors, lawyers, economists, white collar professionals, if you go to them for service, they'll say, well, you know, the fee schedule would be this. If you want a receipt, 300 euros. If you don't want a receipt, 200 euros. That's corruption. Because if you don't get a receipt, they don't have to declare on their income tax, and that's tax-free, what's called black money in Italy. It's endemic. And all of these things together make it impossible for a worldwide common good to really happen. Now, from a Catholic point of view, if economic systems and political systems are so intertwined around the world, by force of circumstance and by understanding the gospel, these have to be accompanied by ethical social considerations. That is, we cannot let the oppression, the free market, the corruption run rampant without some ethical social consideration attached to it. Now, this secular idea of solidarity is already kind of the first notion of what we would call a moral vision of it. Increasingly, this turns more and more into a moral vision that begins to look at institutions. What are they like? And institutions are not merely buildings, but salary structures, laws, mores, government policy, etc. Looking at these requires the capacity to recognize what the church has lately called, quote, structures of sin. That is, Christian theology, Catholic theology, in the past, very much thought of sin as an individual act. You know, it's Tim's sin. Tim does a sin. Okay, Ken does a sin. Tree sins. Very individual, very act-oriented. Contemporary Catholic theology is also beginning to look at the question that there are institutional structures of sin that are not quite so easy to dismantle. For example, in my talks here, I frequently talked about the coronavirus and the whole pandemic as apocalyptic in the Greek sense of the term. That is, it's an unveiling of what was already there. And what was already there? The rich got richer. People of color contracted coronavirus at a higher rate. People of color died from coronavirus at a higher rate. People of color were unemployed at a higher rate. There's something about the structure of American society that in this particular regard must be denounced as being sinful. Now, you take that into a wider global view, and that's just one thing for which we're all aware, and we've all been reading into the newspapers in the past year. This then requires individual Christians and the church to begin to be very, very keen to either create or to modify laws, market regulations, and judicial systems. That there's something off when you can come across these disparities of race, or these disparities of economics, or these disparities according to gender. All of these are typical examples of structural sin. Now, what is it that we're actually applying to these worldwide structures in order to be faithful to solidarity? Here I'm quoting essentially the godfather of solidarity, it's Pope St. John Paul II, who really put as a theological virtue, put solidarity very strongly on the map. And I'm quoting here, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, with care for the social good, number 38, John Paul's II. Quote, solidarity, a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. It's kind of a definitive Christian answer to Cain's question of God, am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is yes. And it's not only my brother that I see in Newton, but it's also my brother or sister working in a sweatshop in Manila, or my brother and sister picking coffee beans in Colombia, or a brother or sister who makes their money extracting the small little bits of precious metals and chemicals that come out of my old iPhone that I no longer want, and very frequently die from heavy metal sickness. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes. This requires serious moral and spiritual attention to profit and to power. We're not really often comfortable applying theological, moral examination of conscience to those two. We're much more comfortable talking about sex, or we're much more comfortable talking about treating one another nicely. We're much more comfortable about being patient or impatient. Those we can apply moral theological categories to. If I'm voracious for profit or voracious for power, Or an organization that I belong to is voracious for profit or voracious for power. Or a country to which I offer allegiance is voracious for profit or voracious for power. This requires serious moral, ethical consideration. This is not merely vague feelings or warm fuzzies and poor little pagans somewhere else around the world. That's nice that we have these warm little fuzzies and we feel kind of bad, and every once in a while when we feel bad, we'll write out a check to some worldwide hunger organization. But the virtue of solidarity calls us to a sustained and regular commitment and attention to this, not just transitory feelings of guilt or warm fuzzies. Now, from this perspective, solidarity is the contemporary virtue that in many ways expresses everything that we've said in all of these series. If you recall, we started off with the fundamental bedrock notion of human dignity. And all this really is human dignity applied to every single individual and every single person and every single human being in the entire world. So it's the widest expression of respect for human dignity, the widest expression of commitment to the common good, the widest expression of the concept of the universal destination of goods. Remember, another tenet of Catholic social teaching, that one people or country or gender or race does not have a preferential call on all the world's goods. They're destined for all, universally. The widest expression of the concept of equality between individuals and peoples. So the deaths of 2 Americans is not equal to the deaths of 200 Africans, although how frequently does our news media portray it that way? It's really the only lasting basis for peace. Because as long as there are people who are willing to aggressively work for their own profit or their own power, there cannot be lasting world peace. The famous statement of Pope St. Paul VI, if you want peace, work for justice. Work for justice on a solidarity model of that around the entire world. We're all, frankly, in debt to everyone else. Again, the coronavirus, the apocalyptic nature, has made it all the more evident how dependent we are upon meat cutters and truck drivers and Amazon workers and essential healthcare workers and people who ship, stock, process, and get our food ready, etc., etc. We owe a debt to everyone else. And in this debt, the positive part of that is that it's an expression of solidarity. And I'll close with a lengthy quote, once again, from John Paul II's encyclical, Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, number 40. Solidarity is undoubtedly a Christian virtue. And what has been said so far, it has been possible to identify many points of contact between solidarity and charity. Charity, which is the distinguishing mark of Christ's disciples. In the light of faith, solidarity seeks to go beyond itself, to take on the specifically Christian dimension of total gratuity, total gift, forgiveness, reconciliation. One's neighbor is then not only a human being with his or her own rights and a fundamental equality with everyone else, so a purely secular standard, but becomes the living image of God the Father, created in the image and likeness of God, redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ, placed under the permanent action of the Holy Spirit. One's neighbor must therefore be loved, even if an enemy, with the same love with which the Lord loves him or her. And for that person's sake, one must be ready to sacrifice, even the ultimate one, to lay down one's life. One carries out in one's lifetime. I think one of the simple ways is to constantly be informed about things. So that does mean some consumption of news, that does mean following trends, and that does mean following some politics. The second point that I would make with this is particularly around issues of foreign policy, particularly around issues of worldwide economics, particularly around issue with the promotion of human rights and human dignity around the world, to begin to apply the gospel more regularly to our political choices instead of going the opposite way around. That is, in theory, we should be prayerfully considering our politics. Most of us shoehorn our religion into our politics. And that ultimately is part of the problem, that we no longer have a moral vision around these things. So I think those are the two very concrete ways. It starts with sensibilizing, being sensitive to it, and then beginning to put that into action in grassroots political